Listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm Frank Sampson, and of course, each week we bring you important, useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and of course, other loved ones as well. You know, we always have a great show, but we've got a wonderful guest today also. We have with us Sherry Cormier. She's a PhD. She's also a psychologist, consultant, and public speaker. Formerly on the faculty at the University of Tennessee and West Virginia University, she is the author of Counseling Strategies and Interventions for Professional Helpers and co-author of Interviewing and Change Strategies for Helpers. She has co-written and co-produced more than 50 training videos for Cengage Learning. Her new book is Sweet Sorrow, Finding Enduring Wholeness After Loss and Grief. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today.
I'm so delighted to be here, and I thank you for extending this invitation. I'm really pleased to be talking with you and with all of the listeners, and thank you so much.
Oh, we're glad to have you on. So I know this is a kind of a tough subject we're going to be talking about today, but the book, maybe we could start out, the book you wrote, Sweet Sorrow, Finding Enduring Wholeness After Loss and Grief. Kind of what was the catalyst in writing that book? Something personal or your studies?
Tell
us a little bit.
No, really personal. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I'm also a certified bereavement trauma specialist. And so over the years, I've always done work with people with, loss. And loss is so universal. I mean, we all have some kind of loss. We may lose a person, we may lose a job, we may lose a relationship, we may lose a house to foreclosure or a wildfire. Loss is perennial and it's pervasive. And so I had certainly done a lot of professional work, but really the catalyst for Sweet Sorrow, Frank, was my personal journey. About a decade ago, and I waited to write the book for different reasons, but about a decade ago, I lost both my father and my beloved husband within 3 months of one another. Now, my father died basically because he was older, but my husband, very suddenly, who'd always been just as healthy as a horse, as the expression goes, right. It suddenly was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal cancer. Yeah. And he was gone in 6 months. And then several years after they died, my mother died. Then a couple years after that, the rescue dog that I had rescued after those deaths, she died, which is why I don't have a dog now, as you well know. Right. I just told you. Yeah. And then most recently, about 2 years ago, my only sibling died. So I've really had a decade in which, personally, I've sort of got hit with a lot of losses at once. And I wanted to write a book that was really like a Sherpa guide, I think, for people going through loss, that would really not only just sort of share my own personal story, but take my background as a psychologist and as a bereavement trauma specialist and say, okay, these are some of the likely things that you may experience on your loss journey, although we know that no one, has the same loss journey as someone else. It's quite unique. But there are some similarities. Grief is certainly, something that even though we all process it differently, that grief and bereavement are challenging emotions and challenging experiences. So I really wanted to blend my personal journey with a lot of the tips and resources from people in the literature and from other grief survivors I've worked with on how do we really move through and heal from loss and grief. And I really want to stress, Frank, moving through and healing, because I get a little nervous when people say, oh, you want to teach us how to move on from grief. We really don't ever move on from grief. Once we've experienced a significant loss of some kind, the remnants of that loss are always a part of us. Right. Yet what we do is we learn how to create meaning from the loss, how to find meaning from it, how to be able to incorporate and integrate the loss into our lives so that it is not incapacitating, and that we can continue to grow and enrich our lives and, and really live a life full, yes, of sorrow, and yet at the same time of lots of joy.
Right. I don't want to, we don't have to get into all the details, but, I have gone through some similar situations, losing a couple brothers, losing parents 7 weeks apart from one another. So I kind of,
it resonates.
It resonates, absolutely resonates with me as well. And I found pretty interesting in your book kind of a spiritual dimension.
Yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about that? And
yes, I'd love to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more. Hopefully our listeners do too, but I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, it's probably one of the, there are actually a lot of books out there on grief and loss, and it might be one of the more unique facets of sweet sorrow. But I will say that many people who lose people, like you've lost parents and brothers, and I've lost my family and a husband, when you lose someone significant, about 50% of us who lose someone, very significant, we get messages from that person after they've passed. And I really, what I say now is after they transition. I don't say after they've died. I just say after they've transitioned. And about 50% of us have what we call, and this happens all over the world, Frank, we get visitation dreams or visitation messages. Mm-hmm. And so I was in that 50%. I've always gotten visitation dreams and messages from my late husband, whose name is Jay. Right. And they've been very instructive, and I have an entire chapter in Sweet Sorrow about all of these visitation dreams, at least up to the point at which I wrote the book, and really how they helped me heal, and also what they were telling me about him. And what I have come to realize, not just from my own visitation messages and dreams and other people that I've worked with, but even in other things that I've been reading. There's a pretty new book out by a scientist named Mark Gober called An End to Upside Down Thinking. So I've studied a lot of these other pieces of literature and books where people who have had near-death experiences come back to life, and they all report sort of a similar phenomenon, that when they were clinically dead, when their body was clinically dead, I should say, they report going to this light-filled space where they experience this pervasiveness of love and compassion and peace, and this place, wherever it is, and neither you nor I nor your listeners have been there yet, unless we've had a near-death experience, and I haven't. But they describe it as home. They said it feels like home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of consistency there in those stories.
A lot of consistency, and that's what I kept getting in these dreams from Jay. That the only part of him that had died was the physical part, the physical body, and so I guess the spiritual piece that I have come to believe, not just from my own personal journey, but from working with other grief survivors who've lost people and reading other literature and accounts of these near-death experiences, is when somebody, quote-unquote, dies. It's a transition in the same way that being born is. You know, we don't know exactly what goes on before we're born, right? I mean, we know the biological process, that there's an embryo and it's fertilized by some sperm and then, you know, all of that. But there's sort of some mystery to birth, and there's certainly some mystery to death. For me, what I feel like I've really learned in the last decade is that the physical body dies, yet there's a consciousness that remains, and that consciousness is energetically present and really surrounds the people that are loved, that are left behind. And I think if people say to me, well, I want a visitation dream. And I'll say, well, you know, I think I can't tell you for sure that you could have one, but I think you can enhance the possibility of having a visitation dream from someone significant who's transitioned. I recommend keeping a little notepad with a pen or pencil right by your bed. And then when you go to sleep, image the person that you want to message with. Image them in your mind. If you have a picture of them, you might look at the picture. And then actually make a request. You might say, oh, I'd love to get a message from you. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you check in. And if, in fact, you do, either that night or on a successive night, you get awakened with a dream, be sure to get up and write it down, because for many of us, myself included, by the next morning, we've lost so much memory of what happened in that dream that it's almost like not having it.
Yeah, and what you're saying, I have heard that same thing from others who've experienced it. So there's got to be something to it. There has to be, whether you believe it or not.
Well, I think there's a real something metaphysically goes on after death. Of course, we're alive physically in our body in an embodied state, so we haven't really experienced yet, unless we've had this near-death experience. So it remains a mystery to us. One thing that I will tell you, one little dream, Frank, that really meant the world to me. Not too long after Jay transitioned, he came to me and woke me up and said hello, and I looked at him and I said, this is a very short dream. I said, what's it like to die? Because I was afraid. And he came back and he said very simply, just wait. It's genius.
Wow. That's amazing.
I found that so comforting, and that tells me that although we fear death or the transition of death because it is a mystery to us who are still in our body, I don't fear it anymore because I think of it as another transition to a different state of consciousness, just like birth is another transition. When we're born, we emerge in a body and we have a state of consciousness. And who knows what goes on before we're actually born.
Right. So, Sherry, a question I have is, were you specializing in bereavement counseling before you experienced all this with your family, or was it after?
No. I just had I had a general psychology practice. Mm-hmm. Most of my practice was with adult women and couples. I did a lot of couples work. But again, when you have a practice like that, there's some facet almost of everyone's issue that centers around a piece of it that's lost. You know, it's amazing to me when I think back about all of the people that I've seen that may not, I mean, I did see, of course, some people that came in because their child had died or their sibling had died, but people that would come in for many other reasons, they would say, come in and say, I feel like I'm having a midlife crisis, or I feel like my relationship isn't what it used to be, and, we're struggling now and we need some help, or, I don't know, I've been doing this job and it sort of feels like a dead-end job now, and we have a new boss, and a lot of my coworkers have left, and I don't know if I want to stay or not. If you think just about even those kinds of general statements, there's always, I think, almost in anything that a client presents, there seems to be some element of loss, because loss implies impermanence, lack of permanence. And I think when I think about everyone I've ever worked with in my life, one of the things that really jolts people into seeking help, and it probably is a good thing that it does, is something changes. Our job status changes, our relationship status changes, our friendship status changes. And there's something that changes or shifts in our life. We don't really like that. We like predictability, and we like familiarity for the most part. And so impermanence always implies something has been lost. And yet I always say the other side of that coin is there's something that can be gained. So loss is not a one-sided coin, if you think about like a penny. Loss is the one face of the penny, and you turn the penny over, and the other side of that penny is growth and transformation.
Right. So I'm curious, is the advice that you would give to people a little different as far as trying to best handle a loss, or you call it transition of a loved one, for someone who's maybe had a long illness versus something that happened pretty quick? Is the advice different?
That's such a great question, Frank. Just this week, I have an 80-year-old neighbor whose 50-year-old son hung up the phone and dropped dead without any warning. At the same time, I have a friend who's, in a very serious state of bereavement because they just lost a close family member to a long illness. It's a good question, and it's a hard question to answer. Death, regardless of how someone transitions or dies, it's still, they're not there anymore physically. Now, I do think with a long illness, my husband wasn't ill a long time, but I had 6 months in which I was told he had 6 to 12 months. So I knew from the get-go that there was very, very little chance he could recover. I mean, I didn't really kind of want to buy into that because I didn't want to be pessimistic. But I think with a long illness, you do have some chance to prepare for the fact, and yet I will also say when it happens, I don't know if it's any less problematic than having someone who is driving along and then pulls over and has a massive heart attack, or, Luke Perry, who just had a massive stroke, and it's been kind of the social media talk this week. I don't know if it leaves the survivor in a really different state. There's still the shock. There's still the numbness. Now, sometimes if someone dies, for example, after they've endured years of dementia, there can be some relief. And I work with people, I want to say, to everyone, don't feel guilty about that. Because if you've been a caregiver for someone in a very long illness, I had a friend whose husband died of cancer after 15 years.
Yeah, it's tough.
She cared 15 years. It's tough. And so she kind of, she had some guilt, and yet she was really able to work through that. And as I said to her, you are still here. You are still here. You've endured a lot of stress in the last 15 years, a lot of caregiving. It's only natural for you to feel not only a sense of loss, also a sense of relief. And I think the shock may be greater when someone dies very unexpectedly.
Yeah, of course. Right. So, Sherry, for our listeners, what are some of the, important steps or, maybe effective healing tools that you could recommend to people who've recently had a loss? What are some of the things that they could do to kind of help them through that process?
You are asking just all the most wonderful, pertinent questions, and I'm so appreciative to you for this. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, Frank, is the word balance and self-care, because when you lose someone, again, whether it's been you've cared for someone for 15 years or the person dies suddenly without warning, immediately we are thrown, as the survivor, we are thrown off balance. Doesn't matter if it was acute or chronic or whatever, we're off balance. And so one of the really important things to do initially is to do whatever we need to do to stay in balance. And usually we do that by what we call good self-care, meaning we get enough sleep, we avoid misusing substances which make our sadness worse, we make sure we get out and move our bodies and get some kind of walking or exercise in, we eat nourishing foods. I can't let this broadcast go by without mentioning how important I think it is to have some sort of spiritual meditative practice, because we know from neuroscience that really calms the brain and really changes the brain in a really important way.
Right.
And the other thing I would say is connection. Grief is very self-absorbing, and Frank, it's so isolating. Maybe we've lost the person we live with, or we've lost family members, or, we've lost our very best friend in life. And that can be just as heartbreaking as losing your partner.
Right.
And it leaves you feeling very alone. We do not heal from grief in isolation. We heal by reaching out and having several close companions that we can share our grief journey with. And that might mean joining a support group. It might mean reaching out to your friends. It might mean reaching out to existing family members, finding a therapist. But developing trustworthy connections is so important in healing from grief and loss.
Yeah. Especially, there are, I'm sure you see it all the time, people that try to remain the caregiver or close, whether it be a spouse or whatever, they're trying to remain strong for that person.
Mm-hmm.
Hold it together for the kids or
right.
or whatever, and then when it happens, then things kind of fall apart. But it makes it tough. So I want to make sure. Usually, I ask this near the end, but I want to make sure we leave enough time, because this is all important information. I got more questions for you, but if somebody wanted to learn more about getting your book or books, or wanted to even reach out to you, I don't know if you have a website or whatever you would like to share with our listeners to learn more.
Okay, super. I do have a website. It's www.sherry, Sherry, Cormier, Cormier, coauthor, AUTHOR.com. I also have a Facebook page, Sherry Cormier at Sweet Sorrow. I'm on Twitter at Sweet Sorrow. I'm on LinkedIn. So there are many, many ways that listeners can connect with me. And the book you can order with a click from any online bookseller like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Borders.
Right. And again, the name of the book again, I'll let you...
the name of the book, Sweet Sorrow, Finding Enduring Wholeness After Loss and Grief.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, I know you discuss in your book, you talk about cancer, all right, quite a bit. And, listen, there's so many, but, cancer is just such a, horrible disease, and so many people have passed from cancer. Can you?
The Jeopardy host just announced this week, stage 4 pancreatic cancer.
Yeah, so why do you think cancer is such a harrowing and difficult disease for caregivers to witness? I mean, I think it's obvious, but I know you discuss that in your book, so talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think there's certain disease, and I'm not sure cancer is the only one, but I think there's certain illnesses or disease processes like cancer, certainly forms of dementia, any neurodegenerative illness like Parkinson's, for example, that are very hard to bear witness to because they have such pervasive effects on the bodies. And the treatments are also often so hard to watch the side effects from the treatment. I think one of the most difficult things about cancer is watching what happens to the person when they're going through chemotherapy and radiation, because those are very potent, powerful treatments. And they kill cancer cells. They also problematically kill healthy tissue as well. And I think when you care for someone and you're watching them suffer, whether it's from losing their memory or losing their mobility in Parkinson's or losing, healthy body functioning in cancer. I think seeing a loved one suffer and continue to decline, is one of the most heartbreaking things that can happen to us.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult.
Yeah. So, Sherry, I'm going to, because I just looked at the time and I could talk to you for hours about this important subject matter. So, maybe just in a few seconds here, maybe you could sum up kind of your approach, maybe in one sentence on, what advice would you kind of give to those who are, going through this process, or maybe your approach, your recommendation? Who
are suffering. Yeah, I would just say, stay with the process. Remember that you may be feeling like you're having a dark time of it right now, and it is important to work through that. And remember, though, that the other side of darkness is light, and eventually that you will experience more and more light coming back into your life as you move through and heal from grief.
Sherry Cormier, thank you so much for joining us on the Aging Boomers. I really appreciate it.
Frank, thank you so much for inviting me.
And I
wish all of the listeners well.
Great. And thank you all for tuning in. Just be safe out there.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.